please subscribe and don't forget to press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video.
Organizations are increasingly using digital technology to change the way they do business. Increased connectivity means a heightened exposure to fraud, corruption, and other risks. EY, in its biennial global fraud survey of 2,550 companies across 55 countries, attempted to gauge fraud across businesses. The findings are interesting, to say the least. The survey found that there has been, in fact, no reduction in fraud and corruption over the last 2 years, with most companies claiming that dishonest practices actually help in the survival of business. When it comes to India, 40% of the 50 companies interviewed admitted to paying a bribe for business. In fact, India ranks 17th among 55 countries surveyed where bribery is used to win contracts. Hello and welcome to CNBC TV18. I'm Shireen Bhan, and it is quite clear that fraud in business is not going away in a hurry, even though anti-corruption enforcement by global agencies and in India has gone up significantly. There seems to be a huge lag between policy and real change on the ground. Joining me today for this discussion, Arpinder Singh, partner and head of India and Emerging Markets Fraud Investigation and Dispute Services at EY, Alina Arora, partner at Luthra & Luthra, and Shad Sanghi, the MD and CEO of NetMagic. Thanks very much for joining us on the program. Arpinder, let me start by asking you, I mean, this doesn't look particularly great, right? India 17 out of 55. Yes, we've seen an improvement over your previous survey. We were, what, about ranked 9 at that point in time?
That's right.
So there has been some improvement, but bribery and corruption, and especially as a means to survival, continues to be the mainstay.
Yes, you're absolutely right, actually. What was a surprise for us in this 15th Global Fraud Survey was that fraud, bribery and corruption continues to be very topical and the highest risk. Nothing seems to have changed from 2012. In India, in fact, 40% of the people polled actually said that bribery and corruption is very prevalent. What was even more surprising was that 20% of the people actually said they don't mind paying cash to win some business unfavorably, which was a big surprise.
And this after demonetization.
Yes.
So it's had no impact.
Well, there's a rumor that there is some cash lying in the system till now. But the fact is that that was a big surprise for us, considering demonetization. Third one is that 16% of the people said that they don't mind actually taking shortcuts in case the business isn't doing so well. So if the business tightens up, they don't mind taking shortcuts. In fact, very interestingly, I found, we did a survey where we broke the number of people by age, so 35 and above and 35 and under. And what we found was that the people 35 and under were more actually okay in doing, you know, some unethical behavior to win business, or if they had a tough environment condition to take shortcuts, compared to the people above 35. So it seems that there's a trend where people are becoming more senior quicker, but they're happy to take shortcuts, and that's the trend which came through the survey.
You know, Alina, this is interesting. When you talk to government, whether it is at the center or the state, everybody tells you, look, everything is online, it's all digital, you get deemed approvals if needed. Then what are we talking about? I mean, how come speed money continues to be such a big issue today?
So, Shireen, while I think the government has been taking initiatives, like you mentioned, and everything is becoming online, but the ground reality is quite different. There are a lot of times that despite digitization, there is intervention at the physical, personal level, and that's where it still gets manipulated. So if you go down the stream, right at the grassroots level where this is supposed to be happening, even though it's digital, the system tends to go down at times. There is manipulation even within the system. And there is a lot of important discretionary decisions that are outside of the day-to-day online approvals and systems. And that's where the big-ticket corporate frauds are happening. So we're not talking about smaller approvals, which is more impacting day-to-day life, but we're talking about the bigger issues where there is discretion with the government. And that still continues to be offline, so today. And the decision-making is lying outside. So there is still manipulation. And there is fraud.
And you're suggesting that this is not, we're not just talking about, you know, local level agencies or local bodies, municipal corporations and so on and so forth. You're saying that the rot continues at the top as well?
Yes.
Okay. Sharad, let me ask you now, you know, I would imagine that what the survey shows up, you know, we talk about compliances, we talk about regulatory action, we talk about action that government agencies have been taking to try and beat down corruption. But clearly, as the survey points out, there is a difference or a disconnect or a lag between policy action and actual change on the ground. What is the big surprise, if any, that the survey shows up for you?
I think I was actually surprised to see that the younger generation, right, as Arpinder just mentioned, that below 35, they are more likely to commit a fraud or do a bribe or take a shortcut than people above 35. So that was extremely surprising to me. Otherwise, I think it was more or less in line with what I expected. I did expect, of course, that there should be an improvement in the survey, which was a little surprising that there wasn't, although our ranking has improved. By and large, there's not been much improvement. So that was a little bit of a surprise. But really what surprised me was the younger lot of CEOs or younger lot of management willing to do the same thing. That was surprising to me.
Arpita, how do we explain that? This point, Alina made the point as well. You brought this up also. How do you explain the fact that respondents under 35 are more willing to take the shortcut, so to speak?
I see that a lot of times when I do investigations and we're interviewing these youngsters who've maybe done some wrong practices, and these are corporates. I find it's pressure. I mean, I hate saying it, to buy a new smartphone, to get a new car, in fact, to go for a luxurious holiday outside India. And, that huge peer pressure to do all these things in their 20s, which may not commensurate with their salary. I had a procurement head who told me he was surprised his procurement manager has done this fraud when he earns maybe 1/5 his salary, but he felt something was wrong because the guy bought a BMW at the age of 26. And
okay,
here
that's
he was
not very smart, is it?
I think some people are pretty blasé about it. And I would say, I think this whole pressure of doing all these cool things and it's all available today. Maybe it wasn't available 20 years back. So I think that whole peer pressure is driving it. Plus, people want promotions every year. You see that in corporations. When I went to an insurance company, for instance, the CEO has all the top performers. They call them star performers. And I told him, I said, these are the guys you got to keep a watch on, because the issue will come from here.
So, what is it that we are doing wrong, Alina? Each organization has its own compliance metrics, code of conduct, and so on and so forth. But clearly, as we've just seen, and the survey highlights, that it's not working effectively on the ground. Is it this focus on creating superstars, fast trackers, that seems to be causing this mind shift or this attitudinal issue, which is the vulnerable piece in all of this?
So I think this finding of the survey is actually shocking for everybody, but what is the driver here is, one, what Arpinder pointed out in terms of, this need to perform and become successful. But I think more so what is happening is the realization in the Indian context that there's going to be no enforcement. There is no consequence. It just carries on. And when there is no enforcement and you can continue to be on the roll and be successful and move on from one corporate job to another without really seeing any consequence, it's all right. That's the way the business works. That's the culture. So why compliance programs are being put into place? More so by subsidiaries of, let's say, the US companies that are subject to the US FCPA law or the UK Bribery Act. These compliance programs are just on paper. They really don't percolate down into action, into enforcement and a real understanding. And I think that's where the difference is. So till the culture doesn't change, I don't think there's going to be a real change. And I think, the DOJ in its last evaluation program made a very pertinent point. We are not just looking at a robust compliance program on paper. We are looking at the action. We want to see it being implemented and successfully implemented and checked. So just don't roll out a piece of paper and say it's effective. Let's see the action on the enforcement. So I think enforcement is the key point, not just within the corporate as internal investigations, which we do, but even outside as a government enforcing compliance and corruption and fraud effectively and not letting it lag and go on with no consequences.
Right. Speaking of consequences, Sharad, how much of this is a regulatory issue or lack of? Alina points out that because there is no enforcement or there is lax enforcement, people believe that they can get away with it, and that perpetuates this culture. Let's just take the pharma sector as an example, for instance. Why is it that company after company and blue chip whip. Indian companies seem to be in the crosshairs of regulators, whether it's in the US or the UK, when it comes to issues of data integrity, data manipulation, and so on and so forth. The question then is one of not just compliance, but of enforcement of the regulatory architecture. I mean, you know, it takes forever for the regulator here in India to come down on companies that are not complying with the law. We've seen several examples of even small things or basic hygiene stuff, like a regulation being put in place to have women on the boards of companies, which people don't comply with unless you crack the whip. So what will it take to ensure more effective enforcement, and is that where the problem lies?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think the enforcement just doesn't exist, right? There are a lot of good policies and laws, some still being framed, but on the ground, enforcement is lacking. I think I can't only blame the regulator for this. I think, you know, one of the things we found is in corporates, and we do a lot of outsourcing for corporates, and we find that most corporates are not really proactive. So they are very reactive in nature. So if something happens, okay, then they'll respond because then it impacts their reputation, etc. So even if you take the pharma companies, all the pharma companies that have been in the news recently did probably react once their drug approval didn't come or whatever they faced. But proactively, right, you'll find, you know, most Indian corporates are not proactive. They can do continuous monitoring, they can take a lot of proactive measures, they can use the latest data analytic techniques, as the survey points out, and prevent fraud. Right? Most people only react to fraud when it happens. So I wouldn't only blame the regulator on this.
No, a fair point. And, you know, we used pharma as an example, but the most recent example within the banking sector is what we saw happen with Punjab National Bank, where for years together, I mean, simple things like the SWIFT and the core banking not being linked, the regulator now waking up to it, the banking system now waking up to something that ought to have been done. You're absolutely right on the fact that we are reactive as opposed to being more focused on prevention. But Arpinder, you know, again, it comes down to the attitudinal issue, right? This doesn't seem like it's a priority for corporate India, is it?
You know, you've actually all hit the nail on the head. I'll give you a simple example. When we do investigations, at the end of it, if it's proven, company CEO always asks, oh, is this guy critical for my business? Then if it's critical for the business, they may take a view to not sack the person, but actually keep him with a reprimand. And that gives a very wrong message in the organization. So to Sharad's point that it's really up to corporates also to demonstrate, I think corporates here definitely give preference to business over you know, compliance issues, and they allow people like this to continue. So obviously the next guy is going to say he got away with it, so I'll get away with it also. Second big thing is, I think the police has to work closer with the corporates, because corporates are very hesitant to go to the police to enforce any action. So for instance, if someone's taken some money, they're very afraid to go to the police station, file a case. And I think that's why the employees go from one company. When you said pharma, forget about you know, the FDA issues, but if you just take simple fraud, I've seen one guy go from one pharma company to another doing the same fraud. I was lucky. I was happy because I investigated 3 cases. But I think it goes back...
And build your ours.
But it goes back to your point that I think it's just bad practice. I mean, and it comes from the top, way some of the procedures are actually very theoretical. I'll give you a very example which you'll be shocked. Is one CEO actually told me, okay, forget paying for a code of conduct, you know, which is actually a principle of all our ethics. He said, I'll just download it off Google, change my name, and say it's this company. That's the way they view it. So I think that has to change.
Okay. You know, where is the most risk coming from? I mean, you know, we talked about several examples of employees being vulnerable, but what about third-party vendors? You know, what about things like that?
I think third-party are the biggest exposure. In fact, one lawyer who came from the US doing FCPA cases in India said, India seems to be a country of third parties. We seem to outsource everything and outsource our risk. And I think you're right. Till we protect our risk with third parties, we're never going to be exposed. You'll be surprised to know, you know, when they do background checks, global companies actually do background checks of all the third parties to find out who are they, do they have a criminal past, are they ethical, are they liaison agents. I've rarely seen Indian companies do comprehensive background checks of all their third parties. And I think unless we start doing that, we won't be able to arrest this fraud issue, because third parties are definitely in collusion with senior management or employees help in perpetrating the fraud.
Okay, you know, I'm not feeling very optimistic at this point in time. Given what we've just heard on this discussion, it doesn't look like we're going to see a significant improvement as and when you do the next ranking. But we'll take a break on that and we'll talk about what we can in fact do to ensure. Back, we're discussing EY's Global Fraud Survey of 2018, and the picture doesn't look particularly promising. Sharad, you know, just before the break, we were talking about everything that is wrong, the many problems, the many vulnerabilities that we face, not just within our organizations, but around the ecosystem. If new laws, I mean, we've just done an ordinance to pass an economic offenders bill, but, you know, if new regulation is not the answer, because, you know, we've got some pretty solid regulation that exists on paper, but enforcement is the issue. What can be done to ensure that we don't come up with exactly the same result or worse when we do the next survey?
In terms of, so some of the things that we can do from a corporate perspective, right? I'll give the answer from a corporate perspective is that, you know, as I said, continuous proactive monitoring. We have what is known as a whistleblower policy, so that whistleblower, if anybody detects any fraud, then they can report it, and you know there's a separate whistleblower for the top management, which can be a third party like Ernst & Young, for example. In addition to that, there is continuous training. It has to be right from the top. So the senior management has to lead by example, and there has to be continuous training. You know, I don't think the Code of Business Conduct is just a paper that you can download off Google. You know, this is something that the top management sits down together and gets the entire company to sign. In addition to that, you know, as Arpinder mentioned, third parties is a big risk. So every single vendor that we work with, for example, in our company, and I think other corporates should do that, go through a vendor check, background check. And there are enough companies like Ernst & Young that do that for you. And, you know, most Indian corporates hesitate to do that, saying that, you know, this will cost extra money. But trust me, the savings that gives you, or the comfort that it gives you that you're working with a well-known company who's already been checked is a lot. So I think all these measures put together from a corporate perspective, that along with the new legislation as well as enforcement, and Arpinder hit the nail on the head when he said that, you know, corporates are hesitant to go to the cops, so maybe, you know, there should be more programs between corporates and the cops, so that, you know, corporates feel more comfortable to go to the cops. So I think a combination of all these factors are required to be able to hopefully get us a better result 2 years from now.
Sure. Arpinder, I want to pick up on the point that Sharad made about the whistleblower. Is this really taken seriously? I mean, are whistleblowers taken seriously? What's the experience on the ground?
So I'm seeing two types of companies. So there are more mature companies which are more compliant. To be fair, those have been changing in the last 2-3 years in India, and there's a positive way. At least they have a whistleblowing hotline. People blow the whistle. They don't vindicate it. They actually investigate properly, report to the board. I think those companies have improved significantly. But there is a set of companies which, for instance, to give an example, put a whistleblowing line as the chairman's email ID. Now, if you have a chairman of a 10,000 crore company, I don't think many people will have the confidence to write to him saying, I have a problem, you know. So I think companies have to look at it in spirit and actually put in a good, whistleblowing policy which allows people to actually give them the comfort to blow a whistle. So I would give it a 50% in India on whistleblowing. We've at least started the journey, but I think we are far away from where actually it's running fully efficiently. All complaints are getting arrested. But the good part is, I think your earlier question which you'd asked, you know, policies come in and then it takes time to action it. I think that's valid for the whistleblowing. For instance, the Companies Act came out with the whistleblowing, but now I find, you know, a lot of auditors, for instance, pushing back at companies and saying, you've had a whistleblowing complaint, I'm going to report to the central government, I'm not comfortable with your investigation. I see so much tussle between auditors and companies nowadays. I think that's a good thing.
Well, it's good to have tension between auditors and companies. I think part of the problem is that we haven't perhaps had enough tension between auditors and companies in India so far. But Alina, let me ask you, you know, about the things you believe are working on the ground and what you believe are the imperatives that we need to focus on.
So I think let's just start with the whistleblowing point and the compliance enforcement point that we were talking about here. I think if you look at the Indian corporate world per se, I would segregate it into two parts. One is those companies that are either listed companies which require a higher standard of corporate governance, and then there is the other segment of companies which are subsidiaries of US entities or UK companies, where because of enforcement, strict enforcement and consequences under US law, which is an extraterritorial legislation, they are bound and compelled with making sure that compliance actually works. And then there is the third segment of companies that we're talking about are the Indian companies, the promoter-driven companies that are not technically governed either by the US FCPA or the UK Bribery Act or are not listed. So to say, the compliance or governance standard for them is not that high by law. Now, what happens in that framework is that while the MNC companies or subsidiaries of US companies, UK companies, because they are mandated, expect a certain standard, and the listed companies, because of the amendments to the Companies Act, are adhering to a higher compliance standard, there is a large sector within the corporate world that is not mandated to have that standard. And there you see the difference, the stark difference on, you know, how do you address compliance and the ethical standards, the transparencies and the auditing standards coming into play. And when Arpinder was saying that we are seeing the whistleblower come up, that's true. I mean, the number of whistleblower complaints we are investigating, and we frequently work with the likes of E&Y on doing these investigations. While that is happening, there is the other segment of companies where there will be a complaint or there would be an employee who would have a problem, but he'll tend not to raise the issue and walk away quietly without it coming out, and that's when the fraud becomes a systemic issue. So it could be corruption, it could be fraud, it could be embezzlement, there could be cyber offenses. There's now privacy issues coming up. And the awareness of that is negligible. It's practically non-existent.
I'm glad you brought that up because we've got just enough time to be able to address that issue. You know, we were talking about the FCPA and other global standards that at least companies that are linked to global MNCs need to adhere to. But we've got the EU data protection rules coming into play very shortly, and they could impact Indian companies that are dealing with EU companies as well. So, you know, is there awareness? Is there also a lack of awareness, not just seriousness, but a sheer lack of awareness of how the world is changing from a regulatory perspective?
I think in the survey it came out that Indian companies are far lower from an awareness perspective as compared to global companies. I think so we really have to catch up, and especially with the ITs companies doing so much work with global companies, and I think I've heard that they've been put in the contracts that you have to be compliant with GDPR.
And the penalties are massive.
Oh yeah, it's huge. I think we need to wake up and do more faster because it's really end of May is when the deadline is. And I think, you know, with the fact that, for instance, you have to report within 72 hours if there's a breach, those provisions are pretty onerous. And I feel, but the simple things in India is, I think this, what is private, what is public still has to come out. And I understand there's a privacy bill coming out in the next month. Hopefully that will address it. But I think we have a very slow realization of what is private and what is corporate data. And I think there's a far way to go.
Well, it is a wake-up call, and the fact of the matter is that there's plenty that needs to be done, and it is time that corporate India, the government, enforcement agencies, regulators and employees take these things far more seriously than they have. Many thanks, Arpinder, Alina and Sharad, for joining us here on the show. Thanks for your time. We'll see you again next week. Till then, from all of us here, goodbye. Many thanks.